We start to talk about muscles. We're going to cover the muscle physiology first. We're going to start today. We're going to continue a week from now, and we should be fine. We should cover everything, just hopefully there's not going to be any snow days. So muscles represent about a half of body mass. Depending on how hard you train, in females, the amount of muscle is usually less. In males, it's 45%. In females, about 36%. So what it does, essentially, it converts the chemical energy of ATP into the mechanical energy of movement. If you think about it, all muscle does is breaks down ATP and then during the contraction. Okay? Not only, so skeletal muscle is going to be movement. Okay? For smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, it's going to be a movement of fluids. Think about how many, smooth muscle in the walls of the intestine. They move intestinal content. Cardiac muscle in the heart moves blood. Smooth muscle in the blood vessels. They assist in blood movements. Smooth muscles around ureters or urinary bladder. They move urine. They do maintain body position, stabilize the joint, which means every moment you're sitting, you're standing, you're sleeping, your muscles contract. Of course, they contract more when you're standing because it requires more balance. Okay? If you stand on one leg, muscles will contract more intensively, because it's harder to maintain the body position when you are standing on one leg. They produce heat. That's skeletal muscles. So that picture here shows you very nicely the heat index, sort of the more red you can see, the more heat is produced. So it's biceps brachii muscle. After the exercise, it produces way more heat. It's much more red than before the exercise. Our adaptation to the cold is by the skeletal muscles shivering. Okay, that makes sense. Protects organs. 3 layers of abdominal muscles protect organs of the abdominal cavity. May form valves, regulate valves in the heart, for instance. Smooth muscles regulate, shape of the lens, regulate the size of the pupil. They regulate the elevation of your skin, hair, goosebumps. They have multiple functions. But if you want to come down to it, there are 2 functions, main functions. It's a movement of any sort and heat production. If you think about stability, it's in some essence, it's like zero, null movement. When your bone wants to fly out and your muscle doesn't let it do it. Okay, so it's sort movement. Okay. Now, anytime you see myo, mus, or sarco, that relates to the muscle. Okay, sarcolemma, sarcoplasm, myosin, myalgia. Okay. So muscles. What is the difference between the muscle tissue and all other tissues? First of all, they are excitable. Well, not only muscles are excitable. Which other cells are excitable? Neurons, yes, nerve cells. But they're also contractile. In response to the excitation, they can shorten. They have special mechanism for shortening. And they also can be extended. They are elastic. Muscles can stretch. So that ability, now, not only muscles can stretch, to some extent your connective tissue may stretch, but ability to contract in response to the excitation and the ability to get stretched, all three of them together can be found only in the muscle tissue. So let's talk about major differences between skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. So first of all, in terms of the control, skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. You can move your bones. Cardiac and smooth muscles are always under involuntary control. There are no exceptions. It does not mean that you don't know what's going on, okay? You can feel your heart beating, okay? You can see the dilation of your blood vessels sometimes. You can, come on, when you're peeing, that's the activity of smooth muscles, right? Urinary bladder contracts and urine is expelled. But if you think you control your peeing, it's not through the smooth muscles. I mean, I hope you do, but it's through the skeletal muscle that is called external urinary sphincter that keeps your urethra closed before you actually pee. Okay? At the cellular level, skeletal muscle has many cells. Cardiac muscle may have 1, 2 nuclei. Smooth muscle always, each cell has only 1 nucleus. Skeletal muscle as well as cardiac muscle appear striated. If you would look at those muscle fibers, take that single muscle fiber, you may notice that there are bands across the fiber. Those bands are called striations. Does that make sense? Smooth muscle is never striated. Striation definitely reflects the structure of the cell. Does that make sense? Now, if the structures are different, what is different? The function. It doesn't mean that smooth muscle does something exotic. The point is, cardiac and skeletal muscles have the similar functional mechanism of contraction. Smooth muscle has slightly different mechanism of contraction. Does that make sense? Smooth and skeletal muscles do not branch. It's incredibly cool. You can isolate a single muscle fiber from a mouse, put it between 2 little tiny wires, and stimulate that fiber and measure how strong it contracts. It really can be done. It's pretty awesome. Cardiac muscles do branch.
What do you mean by branching?
This will be the shape of the skeletal muscle. Cell, one cell, like this. This will be the shape of the smooth muscle cell. So far, do you follow me? Yeah. This can be the shape of the single skeletal muscle cell. I mean, cardiac muscle, sorry, yeah. Don't take angles. I mean, of course, there's not going to be any angles. It's going to be pretty smooth, okay? But it's going to be like all bent and branched and going to other sides, okay? So far, does that make sense? Yes. Skeletal muscle can be stimulated only by the nervous signal, period. Does it make sense? So it can only, and moreover, skeletal muscle can only be excited. Does that make sense? I'm talking about, so it works by the principle you either contract the muscle or you do not contract the muscle. Do you understand what's going on? So relaxation in the skeletal muscle is the lack of contraction. Does that make sense? Both cardiac and smooth muscles can be stimulated by nerve impulse, by hormones, chemicals, mechanical stimuli. All of it can do. One of the great examples that you can do on yourself, mechanical stimulus, the muscle contraction and relaxation. Your nails are pretty pink. Okay, or better, your skin is fairly like pink because of the blood flow. If you will tie something around your wrist, make it really, really tight, and block the blood flow to your wrist, it will initially become whitish, white, right? If you remove that tight band afterwards, the blood will rush to the wrist, and it will become not the same pink as it was before. It will become red. Does that make sense? This is called flow-mediated dilation. That rush of the blood flow and increased pressure leads to the dilation, relaxation of the smooth muscle initially. Does that make sense? It's the part of mechanical stimulus. Another example, if you ever sacrificed an animal, and when you open the animal's chest, an animal is dead. I'm not saying that you should do it, but trust me, I sacrificed a lot of animals. They were all mice. You open the chest. The mouse is dead. There's no breathing, but the heart is still beating. Slowly, but it does beat. There's no nervous signal. It's all in the heart. It's pretty much like chemical stimulation. And you can press on the heart. You can mechanically stimulate the heart, and it will beat faster sometime. Does that make sense? Speed of contraction, skeletal muscle. Very, very, very fast. I should bring next time tennis ball to demonstrate you that. If I throw tennis ball at you, you either will catch it, we will get away from it. Does that make sense? Cardiac muscle contracts slower. The reason for that, think about this. You have a lot of blood vessels. And one contraction of the cardiac muscle must send 130 milliliters of blood into the systemic circulation, so that all those 130 milliliters will go through the entire circuit. It's a pretty good effort, and it has to squeeze it long and hard. That's why it's slower than skeletal. Does that make sense? Finally, smooth muscle contraction is very slow. For instance, muscles of intestine, they contract slow. Muscles of the blood vessels contract slow. I will find the video, I can show you. I might have had video somewhere. The contraction of the smooth muscles of the vessel. You can see the vessel diameter decreasing or increasing. You can see it visually. It takes seconds. Okay? Do you understand the differences? I will ask you about those differences. Okay? So usually each muscle is innervated by a nerve. It doesn't mean that, say, musculocutaneous nerve will innervate only one muscle. It may innervate a little bit more than that. Okay? Like for instance, ulnar nerve will innervate several flexors of the wrist and flexors of the digits. Okay? Does that make sense? Median nerve will innervate other flexors of the wrist. One artery supplies the blood. Of course, it's not the entire massive artery. It's a branch of an artery that will go to a particular muscle. And it's usually a lot, many more veins. Okay, see those branches of veins coming from the muscle. Usually enter the muscle at the center and exit at the center. And those blood vessels and nerve, they branch through the layer of connective tissue that surrounds the muscle. Every muscle, like the whole muscle, surrounded by the connective tissue. When you buy meat at the store, essentially buy muscle. And the white tissue, like the film that surrounds the muscle, that's the connective tissue. Okay. Muscles are very highly vascularized. This is why meat is red. One of the reasons, not the entire reason, but one of the reasons. A lot of blood vessels, a lot of capillaries. Does that make sense? This is one of the reasons why muscle is red. Because it needs a lot of nutrients and it needs a lot of oxygen. Okay? And it also produces an enormous amount of waste, mostly during rest or aerobic activity is going to be carbon dioxide. But when you turn to anaerobic, it's also going to be a ton of lactic acid. Does that make sense? Now, one important thing, every muscle fiber is innervated by a nerve ending. Okay? Neuron and all controlled muscle fibers represent motor unit. This is a very important concept that I want to stop for a second and talk to you about it. So imagine that I am neuron, and students in general, and you are too, are muscle fibers. So far, do you follow me? So I can communicate with all of you via email. Okay, I have an access to your email addresses on the website. However, there's a class right there, the English class. There are students there too. I have no access to those students. I don't know their emails. So you and I are the motor unit. I am neuron, and I can communicate with multiple muscle fibers, muscle cells. Does that make sense? Do you understand that idea? Okay. Now, if I have a class of 20, it's a big motor unit. If I would hypothetically have a class of 5, that's a smaller motor unit. Does that make sense? Motor unit may have different size, but what you have to understand, every motor unit is composed of a neuron and all muscle fibers that are controlled by this neuron. Does that make sense? Now, one important implication of this while we're at it. If I tell, in the beautiful, ideal world, if I tell you all, bring your labs next Tuesday, you all bring your labs next Tuesday. So you all work together. Does that make sense? It does not affect kids in that class right there in the hallway, because I didn't tell them that. You see what I'm trying to say? All muscle fibers in the motor unit, they work synchronously. When neuron sends the signal to contract, they all contract. We clear? Muscle attachments. Insertion and origin. So origin is the bone that is immovable. Insertion is the bone that is movable. This is quite an important concept. Let me explain why. For the example right here, origin of gastrocnemius is the distal portion of tibia. Insertion of the gastrocnemius is the calcaneus bone. Okay? What does that mean? So how do you know what this muscle does? How do you know what any muscle does? Huh? Really? Okay, so what does it do?
Controls the flexing of the feet
Okay. How do you know that?
because of the tendons it's connected to.
Hmm?
Because of the tendons it's connected to.
So, I mean, so tendon is connected to it, but how does it tell you what this muscle does?
Because when that muscle contracts and it pulls on the tendon.
There you go. So what you did, you contracted the muscle. That's how you check what the muscle does. Does that make sense? You just shorten the muscle and see what's going on. Now you shorten that muscle, calcaneal bone is pulled up, and you go into the plantar flexion. So essentially, gastrocnemius is responsible for you standing on your toes. Does that make sense? Now, origin is in tibia. So tibia belongs to immovable bone. Is it really? Sorry, not tibia, femur, sorry. Okay, of course, femur. Is femur really immovable?
I mean, for that muscle.
Perfect. For that muscle, for that movement, it is immovable. Great. Does that make sense? So for each muscle, origin will be the bone that stays still during the move that this muscle produces. Is that understood? Terrific. Insertion is usually in the bone, okay? In some cases, it may be a ligament. For instance, the muscle here that is called frontalis. Well, thank you. So the muscle here that is called frontalis, its origin is gallia aponeurotica or epicranial aponeurosis, this connective tissue layer on top of your skull. And insertion is the skin of the forehead. This is what it does. Elevates your eyebrows, okay? Because when you pull on that muscle, you elevate your eyebrows. Does that make sense? Insertion, whether it's origin, well, attachment of muscle to the bone may be direct, okay? So the outer layer of the muscle called epimysium fuses directly to the periosteum of the bone. Like here, that's direct attachment, or it can be indirect by tendon. So that is the great example. The Achilles tendon of the gastrocnemius muscle provides the indirect attachment of gastrocnemius to the calcaneal bone. That makes sense? Now, structure. Muscle has multiple structural layers. If you would look at the muscle as an organ, each muscle is surrounded by the pretty tough connective tissue called epimysium. So you can see the muscle, the whole thing, covered in epimysium. Epimysium, if the muscle attachment to the bone is indirect, can continue as the tendon. Does it make sense? If you will start to tear the muscle apart, you will find that each muscle consists of several individual fascicles. So this one fascicle is shown here. Fascicle is surrounded by perimysium, thinner connective tissue. If you will keep tearing fascicle apart, you will see that each fascicle consists of multiple muscle fibers. Muscle fiber is an individual cell. Are we clear? And each muscle fiber is surrounded by the very thin areolar connective tissue membrane called endomysium. Does it remind you of something? The nerve. The nerve. Remember, like in case of a nerve, we had epineurium that surrounded the whole nerve. Nerve consisted of fascicles, each fascicle being a bunch of individual neurons. Fascicle was surrounded by perineurium. And then each individual neuron was surrounded by endoneurium. Same here. You have muscle, which is a lot of fascicles. Muscle is surrounded by epimysium. Each fascicle surrounded by perimysium is the bunch of individual muscle cells. And those, each and every individual muscle cell is surrounded by endomysium. Please make sure that you understand, endomysium is not a membrane of the muscle cell. Do you understand? It's an additional wrapping. So this is endomysium. This is the membrane. Got it? Now the membrane is called sarcolemma. Don't ask me why they needed a separate name. Just accept it. I have no idea. Sarcolemma. Sarco meaning muscle. Okay? Good? If you would look deeper into the structure of each individual muscle cell, and we're talking about skeletal, of course, skeletal muscle, that's important. You will see that inside of that muscle cell, you find many rods that are called myofibrils. Okay, so this is an individual myofibril. Does that make sense? And then inside each myofibril, consists of multiple sarcomeres. Now, sarcomere, sarco again belongs to muscle. Mere usually refers to a building block. So sarcomere is the building block of a muscle. If you think about arrangement of sarcomeres, they're like cars in a train. One going after another. That makes sense? And think about muscle as the Russian doll, actually. So you have rod-like fibrils. When they bundled together and surrounded by sarcolemma, they compose fiber, which is surrounded by endomysium. A bunch of fibers make up fascicle. A bunch of fascicles make up the muscle. Is that clear? Any questions? We can move on. Now let's talk about the cell a little bit more. It's like very, very multi-level Russian doll. Diameter of the muscle fiber can vary, can be thinner, that can be thicker. What do you think will be the difference in terms of the strength of contraction between the thin and thick muscle fibers?
What will be the difference?
Of course.
The thin ones they will be stronger.
Thick ones will be stronger. We'll figure it out. But thick ones, thick fibers, the thicker the fiber, the stronger it is. Okay? So thicker fibers will be stronger. Okay? In terms of length, some muscle fibers may be up to 30 centimeters long. 30 centimeters is a foot. To give you a perception what 100 micrometers is like, your hair, depending on the hair color, is about 40 to 80 micrometers in diameter. So you can actually see the individual muscle fiber with the naked eye, if you manage to pull it out, the thickest ones. Does that make sense? It has multiple nuclei. So essentially when the muscle fiber is formed, what happens, many of those stem cells, they fuse together. That's how it becomes so long and so large. Okay? Parts. Sarcolemma. It's a plasma membrane. Sarcoplasm that fills the muscle fiber is the cytoplasm. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is the endoplasmic reticulum in the muscle. Glycosomes are non-membrane bound. What does that mean? Not only this, they're not surrounded by the membrane. Okay, so it's just pretty much those are bundles of glucose molecules. Okay, they store glycogen, and the protein myoglobin found in the cytoplasm, sarcoplasm, should I say, stores oxygen. Now think about why it's so important. What does muscle do? What gives it energy for contraction? ATP. What is the cellular process that produces ATP? Cellular respiration. Okay. What do you need for cellular respiration? Oxygen, and that's the product. What's the glucose? Okay. So that's the prerequisites for cellular respiration: oxygen and glucose. Glycosomes store glucose, well, myoglobin stores oxygen. So far, do you follow me? Each myofibril consists, as I mentioned, of multiple sarcomeres. Okay? Sarcomeres consist of filaments: thick, thin, elastic filaments. Here's what happens. I'm going to show you the mechanism of muscle contraction. My left arm is going to be, say, thin filament, this one. My right arm is going to be thick filament. This is how muscle contracts. Does that make sense? Filaments slide against each other. Does that make sense? No. We're going to stop at this point. We're going to talk about filaments and sarcomere more next class.